Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. It seems to me that within academic circles and the sort of rise of secularism, one of the main objections that people have towards Christianity relates to the seventh commandment, not to commit adultery, and also the Christian values of morality, of abstaining from sex before marriage and having one marriage or sexual partner for life. This seems to sort of raise the ire of people, and of course we've noticed that since the mid-1960s there's been a massive sort of sexual liberation has occurred. Matter of fact, I can remember being at university and in the 60s, and I was not a practicing Christian. We didn't go to church, although I had chosen to live a moral life, and I had a number of friends. We were all top students doing really well in our studies. And I can remember as we often sat and had talks in the lunchroom or after studies of an evening. In the late 60s, we noticed a change in society, particularly in the way in advertising, in programs on television. And so here we were as just not as Christians as such, although I think a couple of my friends did go to church, but I certainly didn't go to church. And I can remember thinking at the time, one of the things that has been lost is a certain sweetness in society. And so there was, I guess maybe a better term now would be sort of innocence. There was sort of an innocence was lost. And associated with that loss of innocence, I don't know, there were certainly negative vibes that we actually talked about. We felt that there was something about it that wasn't as good. And so here we were as young people, but recognising that we thought that society was going the wrong way, and yet we weren't Christians. Of course, at the other time, there was, the hippie movement and all this talk about, sexual liberation, and there were, many experiments were tried at that time revolving around promiscuity. And of course, that's sort of 50 years ago now. And so when I think about it now, we've reached the situation today where there's enormous pressure on young people to engage in just sexual activities as a result of just being friends with people and socialising and these sort of things. But Paul, for example, writes in Colossians chapter 3. He writes, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on the things that are on earth." And it goes verse 5 rather, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you." And the first one he lists is fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. And so it's interesting, of course, he goes on about this, and of course it's a warning that on account of these, the wrath of God is coming. And so here we have this very clear warning that is there. And as I said, the first one that is listed is fornication. And it seems to me that the few movies that I've seen that it seems to have a movie about this couple, they meet, and then one of the first things they do is they they go off and they spend the night together and have an intimate relationship, something that really should be preserved from the Bible perspective for one person for life in the special relationship of marriage. And so this is being laughed at the present time. These people that holding to biblical mores is considered old-fashioned and this sort of thing. And of course, associated with this in recent times, we've then had all these variations of gender fluidity and laws being passed where enabling people to decide to change the sex on their birth certificate and this sort of thing just because they feel they're of a different sex. And to me, as I thought, I've been aware of this for a number of years, and I thought, why aren't, Christian universities and this sort of thing doing research and looking at the benefits of people practicing sexual abstinence before they get married and then monogamy after they get married for life? Where are the studies? And some studies I have seen done by, secular surveys, a couple that I came across, and they would always have, start off doing some survey and they'd have a number of sexual partners, 2 or less. They never had one where it was just one sexual partner. And so that made it very difficult, for example, when I was doing some research in this area to analyse, well, hang on, what about the people who do marry as virgins and do the right thing about the Bible? What happens there? Well, just recently I came across a very interesting article, research article. It was commentary on some research that was done back in 1934 by a scholar a researcher who taught at the University of Oxford and taught at Cambridge University. And his surname was Unwin, J.D. Unwin. He was a social anthropologist, J.D. Unwin, Unwin. Now, this is very interesting. His book was called Sex and Culture, and you can look that up, Google it. There are sort of free copies actually available at different sites on the internet. And the article I read was by Kirk Dirksen, and it was called Why Sexual Morality May Be Far More Important Than You Ever Thought. And he talks about the research and summarises actually in a very convenient way Unwin's book, because Unwin's book's over 600 pages. It's quite a big book. And he was not coming from a Christian perspective. He was coming from a rationalist perspective. He was very much a scientist. He was not a religious man. But what he found was some amazing stuff. Now, what Unwin did was he studied data from 86 societies and civilizations to see if there was a relationship between sexual freedom and the flourishing of cultures. So this is a really fascinating study. So, as I said, he was an academic that worked at both Oxford and Cambridge universities, social anthropologist, and he examined this data from 86 societies and civilizations to see if there was a relationship between sexual freedom and flourishing cultures. And the thing is that book was written back in the 1930s, before the sexual revolution of the late 1960s. And so it was, uninfluenced by this. Now, what he found was that there were 4 great patterns of human culture, and he looked at how these particular types of cultures related to the natural world. And so he summarised them as 4 different types: zoistic, and so this were cultures that were entirely self-focused on day-to-day life, their just wants and needs. and they didn't have any understanding of nature. They didn't look to how, nature worked or science or this sort of thing. And essentially they were dead cultures. They were just based on, survival in a sense. Then he looked at monistic. He had another group which he called monistic. And these acquired superstitions of belief relating to special treatment of the dead to cope with the natural world. And then there were deistic cultures. They attributed powers to nature or to a god or gods. They were deistic cultures. And then there were rationalistic cultures. And they used rational thinking to understand nature and make day-to-day decisions. So these were the types of essentially cultures that he saw. But then he looked into how these people related to the world they lived in, how they viewed nature and what was happening around them in the world in those four types of areas. Then the other aspect that he looked at to compare and to correlate and look at relationships were the degrees of sexual restraint. And he divided these into two major categories, two logical categories. What happened before people were married and what happened after they were married. So prenuptial and postnuptial categories. Now in the prenuptial categories, he had three classifications. There were one where there was complete sexual freedom, no prenuptial restraints whatsoever, which is sort of like what's been adopted in a lot of Western societies today, unfortunately. Then he's got number one was irregular or occasional restraint. In other words, sometimes there were special times when you abstained from sexual relationships before marriage. And then the third one was strict chastity, remaining a virgin until married, which is the biblical position, of course. So he looked at those three categories. And this is really good because he actually studied that category of strict chastity. Then there were 5 post-nuptial categories, and one was modified monogamy, and that is where you have one spouse at a time, but association can be terminated at any time. And that's essentially what we have in Australia, at least, from the late 1970s when there was no fault divorce was introduced. So what it means is they get married, and while they're married, they're monogamous, but then they can end that at any time and have divorce. And that's the situation we're in now. Then another group was modified polygamy. So essentially in that group, men can have more than one wife, but the wife is free to leave her husband. Absolute monogamy, only one spouse is permitted for life or until death in some cultures. And so that's, again, the biblical position, absolute monogamy, one spouse for life. Then, of course, there was absolute polygamy. Men can have more than one wife, but wives must confine their sexual qualities or activity to their husband for the whole of their lives. And we know, of course, that there are cultures today, particularly Muslim cultures, that practice that particular aspect. So what he did was he looked at these combinations of where their sexual behaviour fell into one of those categories, and then what happened to those cultures. How did that affect that culture overall? So this was pretty significant. And so he looked at the effect of sexual constraints. So what he found was increased sexual constraints, either before or after marriage, always led to increasing flourishing of culture. In other words, the cultures that practiced the most sexual restraint flourished the most. Conversely, increased sexual freedom always led to the collapse of a culture 3 generations later. Now, this is a really, really significant finding. And this was across, as I said, he studied 86 different cultures, looking at those parameters. And in effect, that was the bottom summary. The more sexual restraints that we have, and of course the best sexual restraint was complete chastity prior to marriage, and then monogamy after marriage. And that led to the most flourishing of cultures and the strongest cultures. And when increased sexual freedom always led to the collapse of the culture, and interesting, in 3 generations later. And that's where he goes on, the highest flourishing of culture, and went on to say the most powerful combination was prenuptial chastity coupled with absolute monogamy. And that led to rationalist cultures that retained this combination for at least 3 generations, exceeded all other cultures in every area, including literature, art, science, furniture, architecture, engineering, and agriculture. But he said only 3 out of the 86 cultures studied ever attained this level. But that is really fascinating support for the biblical position. Really, really powerful scientific support for the biblical position, because what these sort of liberal academics are arguing and saying, well, hang on, this leads, this sexual freedom gives people more happiness, and they're enjoying themselves, they're enjoying pleasure and all this sort of thing. Well, hang on, that's what they're saying. That's the message that they're telling. That's the message that Hollywood is giving young people in the films. But what the research is saying, well, hang on, no. Actual sexual abstinence leads to a flourishing and better long-term happiness and better satisfaction in life. This is a really, really powerful scientific finding here, and that's why I'll read it again, that the highest flourishing of culture occurred when the most powerful combination was prenuptial chastity coupled with absolute monogamy. And the rationalist cultures that retained this combination for at least 3 generations exceeded all other cultures in every area, including literature, art, science, furniture, architecture, engineering, and agriculture. He then went on and pointed out that the effect of abandoning prenuptial chastity was when strict prenuptial chastity was no longer the norm, absolute monogamy, deism and rational thinking also disappeared within 3 generations. And this was very interesting. It included rational thinking disappearing. And lately, as we have seen, some of the statements that are coming out with regard to gender fluidity, as a scientist, I think, where has rationality gone? How can someone who has the physical anatomy of a woman say, well, from now on I'm a man, and vice versa? And the law is saying, yes, okay, you can do that, and it becomes a legal document. And we have all sorts of, crazy intermediate things like this happening. The other extreme of that, of course, was that total sexual freedom. If total sexual freedom was embraced by a culture, that culture collapsed within 3 generations to the lowest state of flourishing, which Unwin describes as inert or a dead level of conception, and was characterised by people who have little interest in much else other than their own wants and needs. Now, I thought that was a very, very interesting finding. So these cultures that practice total sexual freedom ended up being characterised by people who have little interest in much else other than their own wants and needs. And at this level, the culture is usually conquered or taken over by another culture with greater social energy. I thought as very interesting as Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul writes, just reading from verse 1 there, but understand this. So he's writing and explaining this to Timothy, and this under inspiration from God, that in the last days there will come times of stress, for men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderous, profligates, fierce, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of religion but denying the power of it. And this is really, really interesting that that the research that Unwin and his co-author found at the time was that people then have little interest other than their own wants and needs. In other words, they tend to become very selfish. And I think, well, really, that's what we're observing in the world today. It's quite incredible. But the interesting thing is, of course, that Unwin wrote that, published the book back in the mid-1930s, and we can see that his predictions predict what's happening in our own culture. Unwin wrote, and this is quoting from Unwin's book himself, the history of these societies, talking about the societies that put aside sexual restraint. In other words, they abandon sexual, put aside sexual restraint. This is what he wrote. The history of these societies consists of a series of monotonous repetitions, and it is difficult to decide which aspect of the story is more significant. The lamentable lack of original thought, which in each case reformers displays, or the amazing alacrity in which, after a period of intense compulsory continence, the human organism seizes the earliest opportunity to satisfy its innate desires in a direct or perverted manner. And so when we look at our own sexual revolution of having your cake and eating it too, Unwin found that when prenuptial chastity was abandoned, absolute monogamy, deism and rational thinking disappeared within three cultures. And it's really interesting that, as predicted, absolute monogamy has already been replaced in our Western cultures with modified monogamy. We saw that with the liberation of divorce laws. The other thing is, and this is very interesting, that deism, or belief in God, is rapidly declining exactly as predicted. Prior to the 1960s, a combination of rationalism and belief in God was the norm for mainstream culture. Not only, and this is one of the commentators writing here, commenting on Unwin's work, not only has belief in God greatly decreased since the 1960s, since this sexual revolution, exactly as Unwin predicted, but there's been a trend to remove the concept of God from government, the education system and the public forum. And those who still believe in God sense a strong societal pressure to keep deistic beliefs private. In its place is a surprising rise of superstition. And that's exactly what Unwin had predicted. Matter of fact, there's a couple of research papers have come out supporting that. For example, Stuart Vyse wrote a paper, Why Are Millennials Turning to Astrology? And he published that in Skeptical Inquirer in 2018. So that's a paper, Why Are Millennials Turning to Astrology? And then another, and that was published in 2018, so just 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago. And then another one published also in 2018 by Denise O'Leary, and this was a paper published in Intellectual Takeout in 2018. As traditionalism declines, superstition, not atheism, is the big winner. And this is exactly what Unwin had predicted as a result of the increase in sexual freedom being allowed in society. And It's interesting, the commentator Kirk Dirksen wrote and he has a little heading in his piece commenting on Owen's work. The swiftness with which rational thinking declined after the 1970s is astounding. In its place arose postmodernism, characterised by scepticism, subjectivism and relativism, and the general suspicion of reason. And this is amazing. Again, exactly what Owen predicted. And it's interesting, those that observation is reported in Encyclopaedia Britannica under, if you do a search on postmodernism, that's what it says, that after the 1970s, when we had this beginning rise in sexual liberation, it's characterised by scepticism, subjectivism and relativism, and a general suspicion of reason. But then Dirksen goes further. He says, but it gets worse. Postmodernism is giving way to post-truth. And what did Jesus say? Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. And it's interesting that one of the consequences of the sexual revolution is in a direct contrast to rational thinking. Post-truth cultures abandon shared objective standards for truth. So in other words, this makes it very difficult in this area to be a scientist. I thought it was absolutely fascinating that here we have scientific evidence from the studies of culture showing that the biblical position, what God revealed to us for humans to behave in sexual restraint before marriage and absolute monogamy after marriage, leads to the most flourishing of cultures and the greatest overall long-term happiness and well-being in society. Remember, of course, if you want to re-listen to this program, just Google 3ABN Australia, or one word, .org.au, and click on the listen button. I encourage you to, if you're interested in this area, certainly have a look at the amazing book Sex and Culture by J.D. Irwin. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.